the Financial Sense Tuesday edition with Jim Poplava. Featuring experts on the economy and investing and looking at the bigger picture.
Hey, John.
Hello, Jim. How are you?
Hey, pretty good. I'll tell you where I want to go today. I had Alan Simpson on the program last week.
Uh-huh.
And he was co-chair of the President's Deficit Reduction Commission.
Okay.
And basically, I don't know if you ever saw his press conference, but he said we gored so many oxes that he asked to be put in the witness protection program. But he basically said there is no way we're going to get this thing under control unless we go after entitlements. But yet in New York, a Republican just lost because they went after the Republican with Metascare.
Yep.
And John, you know these numbers better than I do. I'm putting together a presentation. I just looked at the numbers. You've got 80%. It's like there's no way out for these guys.
Unfortunately, that's the case.
Yeah.
I mean, Simpson's absolutely correct. There's no way of bringing the deficit under control and restoring fiscal balance in the United States without massive cuts to both Social Security and Medicare. And I think it's possible for that to happen, and that's one reason that I, fortunately, am looking at a hyperinflation. See, I don't see any practical way out of it.
Yeah, because there's three ways that is typically used to get yourself out of a financial pickle. One, you can grow your way out. I think it's obvious at this point we're not going to be able to do that. The numbers are so big.
Right.
Number two, you can default on it, and countries have, like Russia, Argentina. Or three, you do something, you just print your way out of it, and the numbers are so big. The thing that I don't understand, John, do you think these guys just think that they can just keep kicking the can down the road? Do they not understand the implications of what they're doing?
Oh, I think they fully understand the implications of what they're doing. They're just trying to kick it far enough down the road that maybe something will come along to save them, or they're not going to be around to take the blame for it. They don't want it to happen now. We saw that happen. We saw that circumstance back in 2008, where you had the system on the brink of collapse, a collapse of the banking system, and that would have been a very different scenario than what we're looking at here. There was talk then of a Great Depression, a great deflation like you had in the 1930s. The reason you had that deflation in the 1930s was that the money supply collapsed along with the banking system. And when I say the banking system, you had a number of bank failures where individuals lost the deposits they had with the bank. The bank went out of business. You had your money with the bank. You no longer had your money. That money disappeared from the money supply. In September of 2008, the system was faced with effectively a global run on the banking system. And backup guarantees from the federal government with the FDIC and such. And whether or not they would have stepped in to fund the FDIC, having let everything else fail, remains to be seen. I mean, it never got that far. But instead, what they did was they started creating and spending whatever money they had to create in order to prevent the systemic collapse. And as it became clear that more was needed, they guaranteed not only the $100,000 in a bank account, but they went beyond that. They guaranteed mutual funds. They guaranteed whatever they had to do. They promised whatever they had to promise to keep the system from collapsing. That's the nature of the beast here. They can't let the system collapse. If they do, it's an outright failure for the Fed. It's an outright failure for the federal government, and it sure is not going to be a happy time for the average American. The problem is that what brought the system to that crisis is still in play. The systemic solvency issues have not been resolved. The economy has not been restored. And you have in place a basic long-term insolvency for the United States. Had the crisis back in 2007, 2008 not broken, they might have been able to kick the can down the road towards the end of the current decade. But the way they responded to the crisis, the way they're handling things now, has brought in the time limit significantly. I don't see us getting beyond 2014 without our getting into a hyperinflation. They have opted for the inflation. That's the action they've taken to do what they're doing, the ultimate price here is inflation. And, it would have been easier maybe to bring things under control back in the 1980s, but they didn't do that. It's too late to moan and groan over that at this point. Going forward, could the system be brought into balance? Technically, it probably could. It would be extremely painful, well beyond what's been popularly talked about. And you look at all the political hoopla that's come out of just minor changes or suggestions of minor changes. Again, it's my contention that politically it's an impossible circumstance to resolve at this point in time. People will tend to move to correct things when they start feeling severe financial pain. But in the case here, once you start feeling the severe financial pain, it's going to be too late to correct it. You're going to be heading into the hyperinflation.
John, and maybe I'm going to be a little sympathetic with the politicians. When they conduct a political poll, they go, what's the number one problem? Everybody says the budget deficit, the debt. Then when they drill down and say, well, would you be in favor of cutting this or cutting that? And then it gets down where there's very little support. It's okay to cut somebody else's program, go tax somebody else. And so we just saw a political race in New York where, basically the candidate one side was demonized as wanting to throw. In fact, they ran political ads of a guy that looked like Paul Ryan taking grandma in a wheelchair and pushing her off a cliff.
Yeah.
And you and I know we're in a presidential election cycle. This president doesn't have any stomach to cut spending. And
it's terrible the way things are handled here. I mean, the type of talk you hear reminds me of the type of propaganda that came out of Great Britain at the outbreak of World War I, claiming that the Germans were bayoneting and eating Belgian babies. I mean, that's nonsense, but that's the type of rhetoric that you're getting, and it's nonsense. It's not the type of thing that's going to resolve the issue here. What you need is someone running the system, Congress, the president, people who are willing to do what has to be done. They don't care about the polls. They're willing to take a one-term stint in office if that's the cost of doing what they have to do. It's difficult to get people to do that. It's difficult to get such people elected in the current environment. Again, I just don't see an easy out on this. If I did, I'd be touting it, Jim. As I think I told you once, once you get beyond the point of being able to resolve the big problems in the system, what you have to look at is what you can do at an individual level, at least to protect yourself against all the craziness that the rest of the world's putting upon you. That's why I talk more about looking at preserving the purchasing power of your assets that are currently in dollars, wealth that's in dollars.
And that's something I think our listeners need to understand. No matter what their political persuasion, there is no stomach with politicians, and especially with an election cycle, to do what's right for the country. It's going to take somebody that comes from the private sector, not a career politician, that says, I'm going to do what's right. I don't care. I have enough money. I've made it in the private sector. I don't need a government pension to take care of me in my old age. It's going to take that kind of person. But number two, that person also is going to have to be able to communicate in such a way that he can get elected. And you know what the media has done to Paul Ryan. You know what the media did to the president's own deficit commission.
Sure.
And that was bipartisan, which was amazing because it was the president that asked for it. There was an equal amount of Democrats and Republicans, and we had the group of 6. I guess they're down to a group of 5 now. Even the group of 6, they were all demonized. And I place a big blame, John, on the media. The media should know better. I mean, if Jim Poplava can look at the government's financial report and see that 80% of the budget deficit is untouchable because of entitlements, it doesn't take a math scientist to figure out, wait a minute, unless you touch this, you're never going to balance your books.
Yep. Well, the media has its own interest and includes ratings. The greater the crisis, you can brew the higher your ratings. I know there was an anchor in one of the popular financial programs a couple of years back who told me how he always rooted for stock market crashes. Yet all the stuff you'd hear that was put forth out of that network was usually very positive and very supportive of stocks. And I asked him why, and he said, well, we get great ratings when there's a stock market crash.
Yeah, everybody tunes in and wants to know what the heck's going on.
Everyone looks after his own self-interest. Unfortunately, this is a time when they have to realize that their self-interest goes beyond what is obvious. It's something that requires sacrifice, something that requires very deliberate and major action. Otherwise, it's going to be extremely painful for most everyone.
John, let me throw another one out there. You know, the politicians are politicians. They're going to try to kick the can down the road, and hopefully they're out of office collecting a pension, and it happens on somebody else's watch. But there's another constituency that we have today, you know, a bigger concern to us, and that's our creditors. We are a debtor nation, and foreigners own half our debt.
Yep.
So the reaction that from China, from India, from Brazil, from Europe, when the Fed announced QE2, that did not go over well with the rest of the world. QE1, everybody was in a crisis mode, so I think everybody just kind of overlooked that. But when we came back with QE2, and more likely QE3 in some form, how long is it before our creditors revolt and say, you know what, I'm sorry, but we ain't going to buy your paper anymore, which could trigger the very hyperinflation scenario that you're talking about. When nobody's there to buy our debt, that only leaves one entity, and that's the Fed.
Well, the Fed has actually been buying all the debt recently. In the QE2, the total treasuries that it acquired under QE2 exceeded the net issuance of Treasury debt for the public holdings. And the Fed effectively monetized more than the debt the government was issuing. Right now you've got this argument over the debt limit, which is going to keep the borrowing from new borrowing by the government contained until maybe August, at which point it becomes a major crisis. So the pressure's not on the Fed right now to make the auctions go well. I mean, they're going to be rollover of debt, and they'll do whatever is needed to make sure the auctions go well. But I'll contend that the Fed's easing primarily is aimed at trying to provide solvency to the banking system. None of the crises that we faced a couple of years ago have been resolved. It's not over. We're still in crisis. And in terms of answering your question, it's just a matter of time before the foreign holder pull back from buying the dollar, and indeed the Fed becomes a lender of last resort to the federal government. The economy is flattened out this last month. If you look at most of the economic reporting in the month, it's actually turning down. And so I think probably come the third quarter, you'll see a QE3 of some form in place. It'll be covered by the weakness in the economy. At least that will be the Fed's cover. They'll say we're doing this to stimulate the economy. They will be saying we're doing this to try and keep the banking system afloat. But the crisis is still there, and if China said, look, we're going to dump our bonds, the Fed still doesn't have the choice. They're not going to let the system fail where they can step in and support it. So they'll support it until it becomes impossible to do so. At least that's the way I read their actions.
Yeah, and this brings up another question, because if you take a look at the last decade, baby boomers got hit with the tech bubble. They lost money in the tech bubble. 2008, 2009, another bear market in stocks. And to add insult to injury, this time their most valuable asset, their home, drops in value. Now, baby boomers, I read a figure, John, the other day, that since 2009, the net new money that has gone into mutual funds has been $47 billion. So they're not putting their money in the stock market, they're putting their money in the bond market. And let's talk about the risk, because they're about ready to get hosed again, because you follow the inflation numbers the way we used to report them.
Yep.
And I don't think anybody listening to this program, John, is buying the fact when Bernanke goes on public television and says, oh, you know, the stuff that's happening with oil and food, that's just temporary. We're very pleased that, you know, the core rate of inflation is under our target of 2%. I don't know anybody that lives on core inflation.
I don't either, even Mr. Bernanke. For obvious reasons, you can't live without food and energy. Right now, the CPI-U, which is the broadest inflation measures, I think it's around 3.2% year-over-year inflation. The narrower measure, the CPI-W, the wage earners inflation measure, is up at 3.6%. It's not going to be up quite as much this month because of a little pause in gasoline prices, but oil's headed a lot higher, the dollar's headed a lot lower. That inflation is going to continue to surge. We're going to be at 4-5% the next couple of months, but even where we are now, that would normally support a 6 or 7% long-term bond yield. right now, most of the treasuries are at a level where you can't earn enough money to stay ahead of inflation. And under those circumstances, people tend to go out and start buying the stuff that they're going to need that they can maybe hold for a little bit because it's going to go up more in inflation than they're going to be able to get in other investments. And when that happens, you start to see people not holding onto the dollars, increasing the velocity. The turnover of the money, which all tends to feed into a higher inflation, becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. We're already in an inflationary environment, and it's going to get a lot worse.
And something I need to point out here is you just mentioned the year-over-year CPU figures are 3.2%, and I think that figure is going higher. So if you were an investor buying a 10-year treasury at 3.05%, you are getting almost 15 basis points below the rate of inflation, and that's before you owe and pay your taxes. If you pay a third of that in taxes, you're getting a little over 2%.
Right.
With the inflation rate at 3.2. So it's like death by 1,000 small cuts because, I've heard the deflationists make all kinds of very articulate arguments for deflation, John, but if we want to count deflation in terms of how most people count it today, falling prices or rising prices, we had a brief bit of it in CPI in 1954 when Eisenhower was president, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we had like 2 or 3 months of negative CPI in 2008, but that's been it.
Well, that was as they reported it, and it was about as bad as it was back in the 50s. It was not a major deflation, and if you look at the way the CPI used to be measured, where it was intended as really the measure of the cost of living, of maintaining a constant standard of living, you never had deflation. It always stayed positive. That's in the 2008-9 period. We never had a real deflation. Most people indeed look at inflation as in terms of prices for consumer goods and services. That's the way I'm defining it. There are people who look at deflation in terms of whether the money supply is growing or shrinking. That's nice academically, but it doesn't have that much application in the day-to-day real world with people who have to figure out what they're going to earn or the type of investment return they're going to look for. You also have people who look at it from an asset inflation or deflation standpoint, where perhaps you're looking at the stock market. I mean, the stock market here could fall sharply, but that would not be at all inconsistent with an inflation in terms of prices for consumer goods and services. It's consumer goods and services that you need to look at in terms of where yields are going, and usually historically has been the basis for the level of interest rates. Again, long-term interest rates usually ride 3.5 percentage points above the rate of consumer inflation.
John, one of the things that I think in a service that you provide that I think is very important, it used to be, if we were going back 25, 30 years ago, you could take the numbers the government gave you, GDP, inflation, the unemployment rate, you could take them almost as gospel. Over the years, we have modified GDP, we've modified the way we report inflation, we've modified the way we report unemployment. In fact, one thing that disturbed me in the President's Deficit Reduction Commission, there was a proposal in the very back that we need to reformulate CPI the way it's reported because we're overstating inflation. So that tells me they have more tricks up their sleeve when it comes to COLAs and things like that. If we can basically restate how we measure it, I don't know, you know all the games they play.
They had a suggested measure, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been publishing an experimental measure for some years now called the chain-weighted CPIU. That's fully substitution-based, which is from the standpoint of steak gets too expensive, people tend to buy more hamburger or more chicken. That's what they're talking about when they say that current CPI overstates inflation. Well, they've changed the CPI enough so that they've been able to knock most of the fixed basket of goods effect out of there and made it somewhat parallel to a substitution-based index, at least in terms of the magnitude of change. If you look at what's being reported now with the CPI and the chain-weighted measure, there's another 0.5% or half a percent, 0.8 of a percentage point that could be knocked off on an annual basis by going to the chain-weighted CPI. That's what they want to do. The idea generally is very specifically, the Budget Commission was looking at it, was to reduce the cost of living adjustments that the government has to pay. That's why they changed the numbers back in the 1990s. But that's not what the CPI was ever intended to be. It just became a tool for reducing deficits for the politicians, where no one dared vote against Social Security. We started with this conversation, as opposed to giving people an honest measure of inflation. And if you look at it the way the CPI was measured in 1990, inflation today, instead of running a little over 3%, is approaching 7%. And if you look at it the way it was measured back in 1980, you're looking at something that's over 10%.
This is something that I think it was in the book I read, Dying of Money, Genzo Parsons talked about, that unfortunately the public will vote for politicians that promise them a free lunch, when in reality the politicians are paying for that lunch through the hidden tax of inflation, so they're picking their pockets.
Yep. Again, there's going to be severe financial pain, which the pocketbook issues do tend to be the primary drivers when people are suffering. That may be enough to change the system, but not until the 2012 election. And if you want to get good people in there that are going to make a difference, that's something that's got to be worked on now, not trying to just replace the existing people or re-elect the existing people who are playing the political game, as opposed to looking at the long-term welfare of the and now what I would contend is even short-term welfare of the nation and the American people as a whole.
You know, John, we were starting this conversation, I said, do you think these people really know? And sometimes what is one of the most frightening things to me is to watch when Bernanke goes on Capitol Hill before the Senate Finance Committee and the one in the Senate, and to listen to the type of questions. Now, granted, this is on camera, so there may be some theatrics there, but literally some dumb questions that, you know, I really get the feeling that there is a degree of greater monetary illiteracy today in terms of what's inflation, what causes it, what's behind it, than it was 30-something years ago. And the best example, John, you remember this, in the late 70s, we used to call them the M&Ms, when every Thursday or whenever the money supply figures came out, M2, M3, we used to watch them, and if they went up, you'd see the bond market tank, you would see trouble in the stock market, the price of gold would go up. Bernanke holds a press conference and basically calls it quantitative easing, which is a euphemism for, hey, we're going to print a whole bunch of money in the bond market. The only guy I've seen maybe perhaps react at a professional level has been Bill Gross, who's basically said, we're out of treasuries.
Well, he's about as big an investor there as you get. The average politician may not understand it. I mean, a lot of them are, they're just average people. The press certainly plays games. The Fed and Wall Street all play games in terms of what's happening, and there are a lot of special interests that get involved. It's just a system that, unfortunately, does not lend itself to self-righting at the moment. When times are good, the average guy doesn't care how corrupt the politicians are, as long as he's doing okay. When he starts to feel the economic pain, then he starts to pay a little more attention, and that's when you tend to get the political change. There's going to be political change here. I just don't know if it's going to be in time. In fact, I would contend that it's not going to be in time to prevent the hyperinflation.
You know, that's almost the same feeling that I was getting. I thought, when the president appointed a deficit reduction commission, they came out with the results, and then he went on the stump and he says, we're going to get this thing under control. And the first guy that comes along is Paul Ryan. He comes out with a plan, yep, and he's immediately attacked and demagogued. And even the deficit commission, when I was talking to Senator Simpson last week, he was telling me everywhere they go, when they get in front of the American public and they talk to people and explain the situation without the press trying to spin it, the American public understands it. And I think Churchill once said, Americans will try all the wrong things first, and in the end they'll do what's right. But I'm afraid, from what I'm seeing here, we're going to do everything wrong before. I just can't help but believe, John, and maybe you feel this way, that we're going to wake up one day and we're going to have our Greek moment where they're not going to be able to kick the can. It's going to be forced upon us?
I'm afraid that's going to happen. I mean, there are a lot of people who indeed either understand or can understand who listen to the circumstance, and most people, I think, that I've talked with are willing to sacrifice to have something work out. They're not necessarily the average individual, and they're sure not the average politician. The average politician, again, plays to what he thinks his audience is.
Well, John, I'll tell you, keep up the good work. Tell our listeners, because you report GDP the way it used to be, you report unemployment the way it actually is versus the phony numbers we get once a month, and also you're tracking M3 and also the inflation rate in the way that we used to measure them.
Well, you keep up your good work too, Jim. I mean, you're getting a lot of important information out to the public.
Well, tell them about your website and what they're going to find there.
My website is shadowstats.com. We have a lot of information available there to the public, including descriptions of the background of the key economic series and graphics in terms of the alternative measures. I have a hyperinflation report that's available to the public there. It's on the right-hand column of the homepage. Again, shadowstats.com. And if anyone is interested in subscribing, I always like to pick up new subscribers. There are details on the homepage for doing that as well.
And John, also tell them about you have, which I think is very important, the very numbers that the big economic numbers we report each month, the unemployment rate, the GDP numbers. You have a primer on that. Tell our listeners about that, because I think it's very important when they get these numbers and they go, you know what? That doesn't sound like what I'm experiencing personally when I go to the store or the gas pump.
I mean, I've been a consulting economist for 30 years, and over time, I have found increasingly that the common experience has moved away from what the government's reporting, or the government's reporting moves away from the common experience. And what's happened generally is that there have been methodological changes that have been made to the various series that tend to put upside biases into the economic reporting, downside biases into inflation. I gave you the inflation numbers earlier. Well, the unemployment rate, if you went around the country, asked everyone if he or she were unemployed and didn't use the more restrictive definitions that the government uses today and has used all along, they just have six levels of unemployment that they report, U3 being the headline number. Their broadest measure now measures something close to 17%. I had in what I'm estimating has been eliminated since 1994. These are the long-term discouraged workers, people who've been out of work for an extended period of time and haven't looked for a job in more than a year. But they take a job, they want a job, they meet all the other qualifications of being unemployed. On that basis, unemployment's around 22% instead of 9% the government's reporting. And the GDP largely tied to the way the inflation numbers are given. It's not the same inflation measure that's used in the CPI, but a lot of the same principles are applied. And if the higher the rate of inflation that you use and deflating the GDP, putting it into a constant dollar measure, which is the way it gets reported, the higher the inflation used, the weaker the growth. The lower the inflation used, the stronger the growth. You're using very low inflation numbers, artificially low, and you get artificially strong growth. The difference is the economy is still contracting.
And I think that's probably why when you look at the public opinion polls, the politicians gripe like, why aren't you happier, or why isn't public sentiment up? I think it's because the reality is people aren't working, or they're working below what they used to work at. Maybe they're working part-time. And then they're also experiencing on a reality basis, every month, every week, they go to the grocery store, fill their car with gas, pay their insurance premiums. Yep. All that stuff is going up. Well, John, give out your website one more time as we close, if you would.
Sure. Shadowstats.com. And everyone a sense as to what's really happening with economic statistics, go with your own experience. I trust the average person's experience over the government's reporting anytime.
I couldn't agree more. Well, John, listen, always keep up the great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
You've been listening to the Financial Sense News Hour with Jim Poplava. The Financial Sense News Hour is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation